All right, we're going to share my screen as I do. And we will jump right in here. Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see you. Hopefully everything is well for you. Let me just reiterate a couple of things. We are in the middle of a series that is on the social and cultural changes of the country that occurred after the Civil War. If you want to ask a question, you know you always can. You can use the chat if you're in your home, or you could always email Becca and say, hey, ask him this. And then for some of you, you have my personal email. Any of you can have my personal email. I'd be more than happy to email you if that would be something that you would enjoy. So we are about halfway. Next week, we will be looking at what is going on regarding the country through the end of this of the period between the wars, really between the Civil War and World War I. And we've been looking at some of the issues and challenges, and now we're going to start seeing some of the solutions. Whether those are good solutions, that's a whole different question, which we will be discussing to some degree today. Next week, Professor Bryson will join us again as we're going to dig a little deeper into this period. And then we've got, I think, 1 or 2 more weeks after that. Then we're going to take 2 weeks off for Thanksgiving. And then I've got a good idea of what we're going to do for the month of December. And then we'll be in the year 2021. And maybe it'll be a clean, we'll wash and repeat. And we'll be into something new. It's always hard to say. We've got some exciting things coming as a country. And I know we're all kind of maybe on pins and needles to see what will transpire here coming up. So the people living at this time, I think to some degree felt like there was issues and they wanted to know what was going to change for them, how things were going to develop. So maybe there's something familiar between where we are now and in our real lives in the year 2020 and where we are going to go. So what we've seen, just again, recapping, I like to make sure we don't get lost, is after the war, the country struggled to figure out who it was. It doubled in size to some degree. I mean, obviously we had owned all of the western half of the continent, but nobody really lived there, except maybe a little bit in California, a little bit in Texas, and really only in eastern Texas. And so all of a sudden, there's going to be this explosion of people going west. That will be transformed. Industry, which really begins to take off in the war, will explode, and that will take off, and that will lead to a whole host of changes in economics. There'll be a few elite rich people for the first time in the country's history. It'll change how the country understands itself from a sense of manufacturing and work. Workers will pour into the industry, which are almost all in big cities. And so then that will transform urban societies. All those cities will explode. We saw that part. The people working will find their own challenges as they go from living where they could, on a farm, basically provide for themselves every day or through the year, to where you work to gain a salary. And then with the salary, you then needed to buy things like a place to stay. And so these things all kind of wove together to cause some problems. There were challenges in the South, which we'd seen in Reconstruction, and then they sort of continued as the South really had its own kind of ongoing challenges. And then we talked about the civil rights issues, both for women and for African Americans, and really for Hispanic Americans, Native Americans. There's this kind of ongoing challenge. You have one of the largest wave of immigrants. So we might consider all those people white people, but nobody at the time thought of it that way. Everybody thought of these various immigrant groups coming with some disdain and some sense of, we don't know if we want you guys here, which is always kind of a challenge in our national story, in our national history. So all these things were kind of happening, in one sense, we could say over a 30-year window. And what we saw last time was that finally there began to be a group who organized to oppose this or to fix this. And one of the ways I teach the students to understand this is that the populists as a group and as a party really identified enemies, people that they thought this is where the problem lies. And in fact, if you look at the platform that we studied last week, and you can kind of compare and say, oh, they did that idea in their platform because they were trying to oppose that kind of thing or that kind of group. And you can see this kind of collection of these 5 large groups that I'm saying that the populists, and through the populists, the majority of Americans will begin to say, yeah, these guys are the problem. The banks and the bankers. Right? And you can understand that. You're a farmer, you're somebody who owns your land, and you've had to borrow some more money to maybe get some seed or get a new farm implement. And now all of a sudden you find out that the interest rate has changed, you're not able to pay your bills. It's not the same as dealing with your friend Fred, who owns the general store, who's in the community with you, who knows you may not have it this year, but you'll have it next year. Doesn't make it easy for Fred in the general store, but there's a kind of a relational thing. Now, these banks are like seemingly far away. The railroad, we talked about the railroad as the leading industry in society, and it as an entity was sort of dominating the landscape. The markets, both the stock markets, which are not as big of a deal for the populace, but the commodities market, but they're really sort of in the same ballpark. And they're kind of engaging in making money in Chicago or New York or the big cities. But the impact to the individual farmer, an individual person, was pretty strong. And at the time, they didn't understand it. Now, we may not like it now, but most of us understand banks and mortgages and loans and interest rates. So it's not like it's an thing that catches us off guard. And then these individuals, like these industrialists, there's that phrase robber barons again, right? That these are the bad guys. They've done something evil to get the money that Rockefeller has gotten, or Carnegie. They've been bad, and maybe they had been bad. And we talked about that when we looked at industry. And connected to all this was this sense of corruption. We said at the end of the Civil War, and then when we looked at the South, we looked at Reconstruction for a little bit. The idea of political corruption was something that was permeating the country. And to some degree, it was a shock because there had not been any, not at a significant level. I mean, you can go back and find critics of the presidents and find moments in the national history, say from Jefferson to Lincoln, when someone did, kind of play fast and loose in the political arena in DC, Washington, DC. But in general terms, that wasn't the case. And we noted last time and a couple of times that, going into politics was a noble profession, something people really thought that their best and brightest from their community should do. And you see this in a variety of ways, even in when the Civil War starts in the South, as an example, a little bit in the North, but in the South, where so many of the regiments were raised up just from the local communities, they would look to the leader politically to take over the role of leading the military, not because that person was a military leader, but because that person was considered to be one of the best and the brightest. That doesn't mean that people didn't go into business. They did go into business, but you just had this sense of which there was a magnetic pull to political life that just seems to vanish during the Reconstruction days. And as more people could make money in other arenas, you just didn't see this. And we're going to spend more time in 2 weeks on Teddy Roosevelt and look at his life as a politician and his life as a reformer and a progressive. And Roosevelt has this great story where some of his young friends, when he's in his 20s and he's planning on going into politics, his friends are stunned. They're like, nobody goes into politics. Why are you doing that? And what they would have said was, we're among the elite, the upper crust, the smart ones. We went to Harvard. We know how to do things. Politics is dirty. It's saloons. It's corruption. It's greed. And Roosevelt was seen as this outlier to want to go into that. So the populists tried to solve these problems politically, meaning through a political party. And in 1896, as we saw, they lost. They made a really bad decision where they kind of hitched their wagon to William Jennings Bryan, who had surprised everyone, including the Democrat Party, when he wins the Democrat Party's nomination. And when that happens, the Democrat Party begins their slow move to becoming more like the party we know today, where largely we would say today the Democrat Party is sort of is very different than the party, theoretically at least, by image, than we've met here in the time of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So what that did as an outcome then is the Populist Party will disappear. So they failed as a third party, but their ideas do not disappear. And so here's their list again of some of their key platform items. And you see I've struck through the silver because silver disappeared. Nobody in the 20th century will ever promote that silver should be a level of our currency. It'll stay gold until we're taken off the gold standard again following England. Whether that was a good idea or not, you have to talk to somebody smarter than me in economics. But for a while, we'll stay on the gold standard, but silver's up. But everything else on that list, you should look at that list and say, well, we do all those things, or you understand many of those things that are happening. Well, if it didn't happen with the populist, where does it happen? Well, it happens with the progressive movement. And this will be what we will talk about for really the next 3 or I think maybe even 4 sessions. So we've spent the time talking about the problems. Now we're going to talk about the solutions. And the progressive movement becomes the response to the Populist Party's failure. And, you know, there's a lot I want to tell you. At the core, what I want you to understand is that this is going to begin to really move us in the direction of that kind of new concepts in government and what that would demand. Now, we've already seen it. Remember when we talked about the urban society or when we talked about education? And we noted that, well, how is it going to be paid to have clean water? I mean, or roads or subways or, you know, schools for children. Well, it's going to be paid by the government, by the local community gathered together, right? That's what this government really is it's us as the civic organization. And that's how it should be paid. But then, of course, you know, then that means the dreaded, dirty 3-letter word of tax. And so that's going to be a challenge for people. And I like the fact that I can show you how the country's ideas about this transforms. In other words, if progressivism had attempted to do what it does 50 years before, say in the 1850s, let's just sort of forget the Civil War was in the mix. It's just in the 1850s, let's do this. It would have been rejected. By and large, the country in the 19th century was solidly in the camp of the founders, which would basically be a Lockean type of government, which we talked about John Locke before, in which the government should have very limited power. And that's because you don't trust the government. You don't trust the government will do good things that don't overreach. And you always have to put in your mind when you're talking about John Locke or our founders or the government we construct, you have to remind yourself we're talking about a people coming out of the experience of strong central government in a monarchy. There's always that piece of it when you're trying to at least understand what they were thinking. So you can see this different change into the 20th century through the Depression. Now, you all asked me last week if we're going to talk about the Great Depression. We're not, but I'm going to use it as an example because you know what happened. So 1873, there was a depression. And what was the expectation of the people on the government? Well, nothing. Nobody went to Grant's government and somehow demanded that he do something. Nobody suggested that there should be a jobs program. Nobody suggested there should be, retirement for the elderly. Nobody suggested there should be some sort of aid given to the poor. Like, no. Then you go forward 20 years, and you may remember last week we looked at this in the 1893 Depression. We met James Coxey, who was just one of several, but he becomes the most famous person who basically marches on Washington. And in the long history of American rebellion is one that, well, we will march if we're not happy. And that's fine. And so Coxey, as we said last time, had a lot of support. He gets to DC. Now, in his favor, the president is a Democrat and he's a reformer. Grover Cleveland, who we met last week. So you might think Coxey would be received at some level. Nope, he was arrested. He got on the steps of the Capitol and tried to read a list of demands, and the Washington, D.C. police, basically sent there by Grover Cleveland, arrest him. But then you guys know, fast forward 30 years, 40 years, and what's the response of the people? President Hoover does more activity to try to solve the Great Depression than arguably any president had done, certainly as much as the progressive presidents who we'll meet later had done. And he does a lot. Now, he didn't want to do those things because Hoover thought those were the wrong moves. And of course, you guys know what happens. He gets crushed in the 32 election because he was seen as a bad person, right? The shanty towns were called Hoovervilles. You know, if you pulled your, I can't show you, but if you pulled your out of your pocket, out of your pants and had it flopping in the wind, showing you got nothing in your pockets, it was called a Hoover flag. If you slept somewhere on the ground and you used just the newspaper to cover you because you were homeless, that was called a Hoover blanket. Hoover goes down in history as one of the worst presidents we've ever had. He's not, but that's how he's received in history. And meanwhile, as you guys know, FDR is held up as this paragon of virtue, this wonderful person. He saved us, and you know, this wonderful stuff. Well, we don't have time to go into it, but what I tell my students is FDR and Hoover did the exact same things. FDR just did a bunch more of them. So here you have a president in Hoover doing more than any other president had done to that point. But what's the response of us, the people? It's not good enough. And he's run out of office in 32. So this is what we're talking about, the new concepts of government. This is what we're talking about, that there is a significant change in what we expect from people. Now, to understand progressivism, and really the whole day, we're going to be trying to make sure you get this. There's some things to keep in mind. There's never one political party. Yes, I know some of you already want to tell me that what about the Progressive Party that Roosevelt runs? Well, think of that one more as the Bull Moose Party. We will talk about that in 2 weeks, I think. I promise. Okay. So there's not one political party. It's various themes or strands of reform. And then what's most interesting about it is that at times people would be in one camp or the other and disagree with the other. So for instance, we know one of the strands of reform, because Dr. Bryson already told us, is women's rights, right? Well, there are a whole host of progressive men, including President Woodrow Wilson, who were deeply opposed to that strand of progressivism. You know, we've already introduced you to the NAACP. I think next week, Professor Bryce is going to give us a little more on the NAACP, but you know they're fighting for civil rights for African Americans. Well, there were several people, including plenty of women, who were progressive, who wanted to have nothing to do with NAACP. And on and on and on, you can kind of go down and you can look, and I'm going to introduce you to some, and she's going to introduce you to more, and then we'll look at even more 3 weeks from now when we look at President Roosevelt. And at various and sundry spots, you will never have all the progressives on the same page as you would have had in a political party. Now, the politics gets involved. And as what we will see is in this 20-year window, both the Republicans and the Democrats will engage in what I call a tug of war over who's going to be the most progressive. And there will be leaders in both parties who are pushing to kind of be seen as and embrace progressivism. At the meantime, at the exact same time, both parties will have their old guard in the majority who oppose this. So it's sort of like today, if you pay attention to our politics today, I would suggest that both the Democrat Party today and the Republican Party today are involved in a deep civil war in themselves. They're fighting within themselves as to who they want to be. And that's part of what makes the year 2020 and the past 3 or 4 years tumultuous, because it's not clear, if I vote for the Democrat Party, which group am I voting for? If I vote for the Republican Party, which group am I voting for? And that's exactly how it was at this point here. Now, here are some key tenets of the ideas of progressivism. And I want you to kind of keep these in mind, because I want you to be making an assessment as you go along as to whether, you think progressivism is good or helpful or not helpful, or maybe whether it accomplished its goals or not. So one is that it involves expertise. The idea would be only experts should be doing these things. Only experts need to lead this. It's aimed at helping the less fortunate, which that's good, but there's usually a little baggage with that because these are people who couldn't help themselves. So you've got experts. I don't think I have on here, normally we're talking about economically well-off people. And so you have economically well-off people, people who are helping those less fortunate, can't help themselves. It's a little bit of an elitist view, I would suggest. The ideas would be that you would use education and systems, organizations to reach the goals that you want to reach out to. So it's not just haphazard, it's under some very specific kind of planning and goal setting and systems. And then lastly, and maybe most surprisingly, the idea is that you use the government's power led by elites, and this is the key part, cleansed by democracy. Now, what I mean by that is what you should have said to yourself is, wait a minute, about 4 slides ago, you said the enemies were the politicians. They're the bad guys. They've caused all these problems that we're dealing with. And for the populists and now for the progressives, they would have agreed, yes, but they now claim that they have a solution. And this is interesting to me. What their solution is more democracy, quote unquote. And this is the time in which the country really begins to shift from, again, how the founders described that we are a republic, which is what we still are legally, to today, you probably know you could go poll 15 or 20 people on the street and most of them would say we're a democracy. And in fact, the Sentinel just had an article last week, made me want to go shake somebody, because here was some national, columnist talking about, well, we are a republic, but it's a democracy. And I'm like, you're killing me. And it's too much to get into now. Actually, this is going to be, I think, the topic we're going to look at in December to try to help us understand more about what should the country be based on our Constitution. But in any case, connected to this is this idea that democracy was somehow holy. Somehow it was pure. Somehow it was cleansing, right? Again, if there's dirt in the government, the solution is more democracy. They believe that more people being involved would be better. And again, just you've seen this slide before, for the founders, they disagreed deeply with this. And when they structured the government, they were trying to avoid 2 extremes. Now, we may not have avoided them, but regardless, their 2 extremes were they wanted to not have snob rule. So again, they would have had a problem with the elitist kind of flavor of progressivism, but they didn't want mob rule. Our founders would, I think, have been unhappy with J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and Carnegie because they were an aristocracy or an oligarchy. And that would have made our founders unhappy, but they didn't think the solution lay in democracy. And again, I think it's important as we're heading into, we're voting now, and the election day is, less than 2 weeks away now, or about 2 weeks away. In fact, I had somebody tell me this yesterday. They said, well, we can't let the people vote because they're stupid. And I'm like, that's not really fair. What the founders believed was that the people, and I'm talking about myself, that were too easily misled. So the danger that Madison, you can read the quote there, the danger that Madison is suggesting is that it was too turbulent, is because it's too easy to convince a group of people that they've been wronged or aggrieved, and then that can lead to chaos. So the founders thought that, the progressives disagreed and obviously believed that the solution lay in more democracy. Now, when you look at progressivism and you look at the progressive movement, you can see that it's driven by different groups, which again will speak to the fact that there's not a united political agenda. There's a variety of agendas of people who are going down the road they think is important, and at points would disagree deeply with other progressives. Principally, and we heard this with Professor Bryson, women and Christians. Those two are amongst the driving forces who kind of carry us down the road of let's get something done here. You will have special interest groups emerge. I probably should have had journalists on there, because the journalists will take a really critical role. Professor Bryson is going to look at this next week. And the journalists play a critical role also in driving progressivism forward. And much like we saw with the rise of the abolition movement, all of this goes back to another Great Awakening. Now, you remember we've talked about the Great Awakenings before. They are much like the Great Crisis moments. Every 80 some odd years separated. So every 80-ish years was a Great Awakening. Our last Great Awakening was in the 60s. So you can do the math from there and say, oh, somewhere in 2040, 2050, if the pattern holds, we should have a Great Awakening. We shall see, obviously. The Great Awakenings have obviously a religious or spiritual connection that becomes kind of the focus of what they're coming for. And those are all valuable. For the first three, they're exclusively Christian. The last one in the 60s was not, very pluralistic, still very similar. They all have speakers going around preaching and talking and, and delivering messages. It's all very exciting to young people. And you have kind of this burst of enthusiasm for spiritual matters. And politically or historically, all of the Great Awakenings connect back to our Puritan forefathers and mothers dealing with the city on the hill concept, which you may remember. Winthrop, the leader of the Puritans, gives a sermon when they first get there in the 1630s. And he says, we're going to basically create a society that should be emulated, and it should be like a city on a hill. So it's city on a hill. You can't miss it. It's up there. It's visible. We're going to try to show England and how they should be doing society. That's the whole idea. And you can sort of think of the Great Awakenings as, yes, that's our point. And then 80 years later, we've sort of forgotten. And then, oh yeah, that's why we're here. And then 80 years later, we've sort of forgotten. And so that's kind of the driving point. For my history classes, though, obviously we're not at a religious school, so we're not focusing on Christianity or faith. And we talk about these things and different religions. The point for us in American history is that each Great Awakening has a non-Christian outcome, meaning it has an outcome that impacts American society and the flow of history. That's why they're very important. So the first Great Awakening, we've talked about it. If you remember back a couple of years ago when we did the American Revolution, it was the moment in which the British citizens, for the first time, really saw themselves as a united something. They would not have called themselves a nation, but there was an awareness that they actually did have a little bit of a difference from their English cousins. So that's really kind of important. Remember most recently, we talked about the road to the Civil War, the Second Great Awakening, the outcome is the rise of the abolition movement and manifest destiny. And again, in both of these, and you can see on the slides, there's kind of showing you that there's always new groups that emerge, new denominations. There's always divisions. Typically what happens is there's a settled, Christian group, like back here, I'll go back one, the Presbyterian Church in America, really coming out of Scotland in the 1740s, and it splits, and it always splits, or almost always splits in a, will you kind of accept the new ideas within the Christian faith that's being promoted? So there's the 1840s. So 1820 plus 80, 1900. So this Third Great Awakening is one that deals with, and if you really are interested in Christianity and the journey of Christian denominations, it's one that deals with an emergence of Spirit, Holy Spirit. It's one of the three members of the Trinity within the Christian faith. Spirit-led, spirit activity, and it gives the rise to a group, a denomination, or a movement within Christianity called Pentecostalism. And so you can see some of the churches that are there. Well, the outcome for us, though, as it relates to progressivism, is that there emerges in this time, because most of these churches that you're looking at here that emerge in Pentecostal, most of them emerge in big cities or near big cities. So there kind of becomes this idea of what we eventually will call a social gospel, social justice, social gospel, the idea that your religion needs to be visibly active in the community and life where you live, not just through your words, but through activity at the social level, right? So think about all the issues we're talking about: workers, labor, immigrants, civil rights. The social gospel movement pursuing the social justice is therefore then saying, hey, you should step into this. And the best example of this, do you remember back in the 90s, the 1990s, when the kids started sporting the bracelets WWJD? You remember those? What would Jesus do? That's what it stood for. And I was a youth pastor back then at First Baptist Winter Park. And you go to Winter Park High School, you go to Maitland Middle School, you go over here to Glen Ridge, and you'd see kids with these little bracelets with 4 little things on them, WWJD. What would Jesus do? Well, most of those kids did not realize that 4 letters and that idea was born out of the progressive movement and the Third Great Awakening. In 1896, a pastor, Charles Sheldon, wrote a novel. It's really kind of a light novel. Literary people will argue whether it's a good novel or not. It becomes one of the most popular. At one point was, I believe, the number 2 or number 3 best-selling book in the country. But it was called In His Steps. And basically what Sheldon writes is a story that suggested Jesus was back in this urban city. And he was in Kansas, but I don't believe he sets the novel in Kansas. I think he just sort of sets it in an urban city. And it basically depicts Jesus interfacing with these people who are the people we've met: the poor worker, the immigrant, the farmer. And then the question that Sheldon was basically posing to Christians and in his community was, well, if you're going to call yourself a Christian, that's what you should do. The point of it is that you have this movement going forward that suggested it was a moral duty to enact these changes. And I think that's an important concept, because progressive and progressivism as a term has obviously come back in like the last decade. In fact, many Democrats will not call themselves Democrats. They call themselves progressives. And there's a whole bunch of, labels and name calling and stuff going around. And so when you talk to people, or when I talk to people who are thinking of voting on the left, voting Democratic for, different issues, a lot of times you will get that same kind of moral sense, like this should be done for this moral good that needs to be done for poor people or for civil rights or for equity, those kinds of things. And that all goes back, in my opinion, to the Third Great Awakening. It goes back to Charles Sheldon, into this social gospel movement saying, hey, you should be out there doing things. What's also interesting is that most of the social gospel people, including Sheldon, who would have arguably started by saying, all of us Christians in this church or all of us Christians in this denomination should go and do good things in that neighborhood or that society, they will move to where the larger progressive movement is, which is really, we're going to need the power of the government to make these things happen. So we will kind of marry ourselves, we'll align ourselves with this belief that the larger government is demanded to be active to do these things. Sometimes I think the social gospel leaders would have said that because the cost was too high. Sometimes they would have said that because the reach was beyond where their church or denomination. In any case, the point for you and me is to sort of just see what's the impetus, what's really pushing behind the scenes, in this activity. And the changes that occur in the country in the next 20 years will be mind-blowing. And you've already figured out, of course, I'm sure, that what happens through the Great Depression and the New Deal work of FDR is on that agenda. So there's even more changes that are going to come as we go through our next great crisis moment. The outcome of that that great crisis around the Great Depression and the war, World War II, will be again a change in government that is just giving the government so much more power than the founders would have thought necessary. Now on that, let me make sure I say, as I hope I have described to you, myself and Professor Bryson, there's a lot of problems in the country, and the founders weren't imagining somebody would have the millions of dollars that JP Morgan had, or that the work would all be in these dirty factories. They would have not foreseen that. Not even Alexander Hamilton, who everybody likes to talk about. He was the most far-seeing, and he saw an industrial country. So, okay, a little bit, yes, a little bit, but even they didn't see that. So it's not to say the progressives and the progressive ideas were wrong and there's no problems, or they did bad things and they shouldn't have because there was no problems. I think the point we have to kind of address as we move into the 20th century is say, wow, there's some real problems, and I'm not sure what our own founders would have said, and maybe this was the best opportunity that we could try. Well, let me show you some other areas that Professor Bryson isn't going to cover, kind of walk you through. Most of the changes that I will talk about tonight are political. So there's a whole raft of things that ultimately do get done in a political arena, but again, not by a political party. There's no populist party waving the banner of progressivism that gets this stuff done. Perhaps one of the most impactful, I deeply disagree with this one, is the 17th Amendment, which comes out in 1912, which is the time of choosing of the senators. So the founders, as you hopefully remember from our Constitution, had structured different ways for the apparatus of government to work. As we're watching right now, the Supreme Court is nominated by the president, affirmed by Congress. The president is elected by a small electoral college. The people are not supposed to have anything to do with the president's election, which is another thing you can tell we've changed. The representatives were to be elected by the people. For the founders, they looked at that as the people's house, that this was the people. That's why the budget is supposed to be constructed by the Congress, not by the president. Every time you hear a president be asked about the budget, it makes me just want to scream out loud. I want us to elect a president one day who will say to the question of the journalist, when they say, what are you going to do with the budget? He's like, the budget's not on me. The budget belongs to the people of this country, and that's in House of Representatives. So of course, then lastly, the Senate was to be chosen by the state legislatures. And the thought there was that the senators were like a version of an ambassador from the state to the national government. And the best way to watch the national government through the ambassador was to make sure these two people were chosen at the local level. So you choose that by choosing who your state legislator is. And the thought, again, is my state legislator is probably somebody from my neighborhood. I know where he or she lives. I can go find them. I can go talk to them. If I need to, I can threaten them. And if I'm mad about a decision the national government's making, I can basically tell my representative, you need to get a hold of that senator and put pressure on them. So the progressives thought to the opposite, that democracy would do this. And they were trying to eliminate the influence of big money, the money that we've seen in the industrialists, and kind of stop corruption. If the people chose the senators, you'd have no corrupt people, you'd have no corrupt senators. Well, and this is the only time I'm going to do this, I suppose, but I find it, we're now 108 years later. Did it work? Did the progressive ideas work? I wish you were there to have a conversation. I'd let you kind of chime in. I would suggest the answer to that question is no. And the most damning thing about it is this. Up until the 17th Amendment, the senators' average length of term was 8 years or 9. I've looked this up. It's 8 or 9 years. So senators get a 6-year term. So what that tells us is, as the founders believed, the senators were often in a revolving door. Sometimes they changed every year, every 6 years, because back at home, the state legislature would want to reward somebody else. So we're going to send you, Bob, you're going to go up there, and then we're going to send you, Elizabeth, you're going to go up there, and you're going to send, you, and you'll go up there. And so you're 6 years, and then you come home. You're 6 years, and you come home. And then imagine, obviously, if the political powers of the state changed, well, they immediately pulled the senators home. You're not going back. We're sending 2 new people. Since the 17th Amendment, the average for the senators is roughly 22 years to 24 years. And some senators are there for 30 and 40 years, which was precisely what the founders were trying to avoid. So on this one, I think the progressives got it wrong. But again, why they do it? Because they believe in the ideas that more democracy would be to a benefit. What else did they change? Well, they changed how nominations happen. This is interesting. You guys may know we're voting on an amendment to our state constitution about this right now. Right now, we have a nomination process for all parties. So there's 2 major parties, but I suppose if the Libertarian Party or the Green Party wanted to have an actual primary, they'd do the same thing. You'd have to be a card-carrying member to get to participate. And you guys know, I believe it's the 3rd Amendment that we're voting on. There's a movement to say there should be no primaries, but it should just be one big gigantic primary. Well, 100 years ago, they were having the same sort of debate, except there, the debate was about having the primaries in the first place. Because up to that moment, the way things happen is really the national leaders of the party would just make their own choices. Or at the state level, for like senators, representatives, the governor, the party leaders, the insiders, people who paid the most money, had been there, they kind of just did their own thing. So the ideas of reform were that we could make significant improvement by having a process by which the people would vote in a primary. So the very thing people are mad about now was actually a reform 100 years ago. And we were actually the first state to use the direct primary in nominating. So again, I find it quite ironic that we're now on this cutting edge of maybe getting rid of primaries. They also, reformers, led to the changes that allowed for secret voting. And many people don't realize that voting previously in the 19th and 18th century was done in the open because voting was considered a civic opportunity. So you know we have election day. You all know this. And of course, there's a lot of things changing around election day as we speak. But one of the aspects of election day, what it used to be, was that there was this moment when everybody would come to the polls as a community and they would watch. Now, of course, that was also at a time when not everybody got to vote because voting was typically tied to land, which is a story we've explained before, so I won't take our time to do it now. Obviously, as the numbers change and you get bigger and bigger and bigger, you don't have time to sit and watch 3,000 people vote one at a time. But what also happened out of Reconstruction, as we talked about, was there began to be a greater level of pressure put on people. And it happened mostly in the South, where you had, as we've talked about before, the Democratic Party really developing this kind of white-only party, so that if you're a white person who wanted to vote with the Republicans, or certainly if you were a person of color who wanted to go vote, you would be deeply scrutinized and sometimes threatened and sometimes physically assaulted. And so that obviously impacts the voting process. If you walk into the voting booth at the Winter Park Library and you think there's 20 or 30 people there, maybe armed, and they're watching where you're going to put your ballot and which one, that would change how a lot of people would choose to vote. But you know, we're going to go secretly have our little box and we'll put our little head in our box and we'll do our little thing. That's private. That all starts out of progressivism. That's a good thing, I think. Other ideas that emerged at this time in progressivism were ways to give the people more influence. These three things, the idea of an initiative, the idea of a referendum, and the idea of the recall, all were ways, and you should be able to see how this kind of plays in to the more democracy point of view. That idea of the story of giving the people more power. So the one was the initiative. You don't have to really wait for your local representatives to come up with an idea. You can have a process by which you can just put something on the ballot. Again, interestingly, one of our amendments in the past, actually decade here in Florida, there's been a lot of fighting about how many days you need and how many signatures you need. And it's a whole big mess about trying to control. If you listen to the sides of it, you usually can hear one side being on the progressive pro-democracy side that suggests that the amendment is trying to harm, or the opposition to the amendment is trying to harm, involvement of the people. The idea of a referendum would be that if the legislature actually did do something that citizens don't like, they could vote against it. That's only about halfway. Even now, only about half the states. I don't think we have this in our state. And then the recall was probably the weakest of the three, and not surprisingly, the politicians, they didn't want this to happen, because the recall is like, we're just going to call you back. We're going to vote again and get rid of you. And so there are places that have that, places that don't have that today in the year 2020. They're going to actually try and look at attacking the corruption at the city level. How can we change the system? So if you remember, we looked at urban life in our session, we talked about how urban life and urban government was really kind of like almost a mafia. I mean, it was the boss system where it was kind of just run. Tammany Hall in New York City is the most famous, but by no means the only. There were bosses even at small city level. So you can go down to a town of 10,000 and there's probably somebody who runs the city. You guys probably remember the TV show, and now my brain went totally out the window, but it was set in the country and there was Boss Hogg, who kind of ran things, the General Lee, and those guys kind of running moonshine in the rural parts of the country. Well, that idea of a single person or family controlling a society developed in this time. So reformers were like, no, we need to fix this. And two different plans emerged, and there's more than this now, but emerged out of the process. One is the City Commission plan. Galveston, Texas was hit with a horrible hurricane, and they decided that the structure they had for government was inefficient. So in the City Commission plan, you vote for commissioners to be the commissioner of various operations of the city. So the water commissioner, the school commissioner, the police commissioner, and there might be 8 or 9 of these or 4 or 5 of these. The City Commission plan does not usually have a mayor or any kind of a leader. There's just the commission. There might be a leader of the commission, but that person's kind of usually got this role. Nobody's in charge like a boss to be able to then kind of gather power to themselves. The other plan was the city manager plan. In the city manager plan, there are a group of, and it's typically counselors. Now, the city of Winter Park calls them commissioners, which confuses the issue. But you have city council, which is, some number of people who are elected either by the whole city or by wards or areas of the city. And there may be a mayor in this, but the city manager is hired to be kind of a business person or maybe an engineer in which they run the workings of the city. Their job is to deal with the details. The counselor's job is to set policy, legislative, and the law. Again, the main point for both the city manager plan and I'll go back up to the city commission plan was to say we want to take power away from these individuals who just sort of seem to have it because they have it. And they've got their own little system, through the saloons or through people who know people. And instead, we're going to set it up so that there's an elected kind of democratic process that puts specific people and usually someone with a certain skill set in charge of things. Wisconsin becomes like the leading incubator of these plans, of these ideas. And we won't go into all the details of this, but just understand that Robert La Follette becomes one of the leading progressives. He's a Republican. So again, not part of a party. He's just a Republican who's a progressive. And in Wisconsin, Wisconsin will be a place under his leadership that will roll out a whole host of changes in social and cultural life, many of which will go national. And we'll look at those in the next 2 or 3 weeks as they go national. Notice that they start off by saying we're going to include experts. So there's that idea of you want experts to make the decision, to be involved. And that idea of expertise is some of the things that begin to change in other areas of life. Again, progressivism, wide swath, going down lots of arenas. So one was in medicine, another was in law, another was in education. And for all of these, they take almost a very similar path, which is you begin to see the development of a series of standards with institutions involving education, involving processes by which someone had to prove they're worthy. So no longer could you become a doctor by spending 5 years as a young person riding along with another doctor. You had to go to school and you had to get approval by the American Medical Association. No longer could you become a lawyer just by clerking for another lawyer in town. You actually had to go to school and get a degree, and then you had to have the degree to pass the bar. Previously, you could try to pass the bar without the degree, but now you needed the degree. And in education, you begin to see schools of education. Now, we already had some of those with the Normal Institute we talked about when we looked at Tuskegee, but these begin to make some serious changes to beginning the process of creating a degree of education. So there's people who I work with at Valencia who their master's or their PhD is in education. And that's a brand new or only in the last century kind of structure. But again, the overall process of reform, going down the road of you set systems in place that are overseen by experts for the protection of everybody else. You see education's changes in this time period, how it rolls out to the average person, involving some key things like kindergarten, the idea of adding the 3rd and 4th year of high school, the idea that the states would pay for the textbooks. The states would provide the instructional materials, no longer the parents who had to provide the instructional material. School attendance becomes mandated, becomes mandatory. You have to go to school. And of course, you can see how this will eventually dovetail with the ending of child labor laws or the introduction of child labor laws to eliminate children at work, but instead putting them to school. We talked about already previously the Land Grant Act that will bring colleges to rural areas in the West and the South. You begin to see more women going to school, and not just at women-only institutions. Initially, only women-only institutions, but some of the larger schools in the East and on the East Coast will begin to accept women. And by the early 20th century, education will have moved away from the idea of just a liberal education that everybody sort of studies the same thing, to the narrow paths we know today of what's your major, what are you majoring in school? So that's a change that occurs at this time. And then lastly, we'll see a change in economics. So another one of the things that you and I know, every April rolls around, we have to pay our taxes. Well, that is only because of the 16th Amendment. So again, thank you, progressives. Thank you, populists. Alongside the changes to allowing a graduated income tax was actually a return to something that the founders argued about themselves. And that was whether or not there should be control by the federal government over banking. Today, there is. The Federal Reserve is that control over banking. And that will all come, that part will actually come under when President Roosevelt comes into office. But before that, in the first 2 decades, there'll be increased conversation, just like the populists wanted, to say the government's going to have to control banks in some capacity. Well, alongside that, change in economics emerges or comes to America. I've already mentioned this, but just sort of getting it to you again, comes the idea of socialism. Now, socialism is a European idea, and I would suggest to us that progressivism and socialism are largely in the same arena. In the 1830s, 1840s in Europe, due to industrialism, due to urbanism, remember, Europe and England were ahead of us in all these things. There emerged, again, this desire for solutions, and the solutions broadly, at least by the socialists, were that there should be a focus on cooperation, whereby a community or a state or some larger group would pool the resources so that everyone was provided for. You'd have, there were industrialists who built, by their factories, they built towns for everyone. Karl Marx changes this to a little bit. We don't have time to really get into the depths of the differences between communism and socialism. Socialism is a really broad umbrella, covers a lot of ground with a lot of different pieces. But in general terms, it's a society pooling resources together. Sometimes you can have private property. Communism, you wouldn't have private property. But in general, it's opposing the idea of capitalism, which allows every individual the freedom to pursue their own thing. Well, as we already saw, it doesn't really get a good foothold here, but in these 2 decades, there will be the beginnings of this movement. And we talked about Debs and the Socialist Party before, so I won't go through it again. But in this time period, as an example of their growth, they will create leaders in the socialist movement, and some progressives who weren't socialists will create their own labor party to compete with the AFL. They saw the AFL as being soft, compromise-oriented. You almost could say, this is not a great analogy, you almost could say that the industrial workers of the world, the Labor Party created by the Socialist Party, is to the AFL the way the NAACP was to Washington and his Tuskegee machine. Too much accommodation, too much waiting. We need to be more aggressive. And the IWW becomes a really aggressive, agitate, really push kind of labor organization. Again, fighting for rights for workers, but also at the same time, really pushing this issue of an economic development, that we have to really kind of move down that road to try to find equity within economics to be able to get the better society that we're looking for. So it's also, we'll see progressivism in foreign policy. I'm not going to talk about this one tonight. I was going to, but we don't really have time. We're running a little late. I just want you to not worry about that. But I want you to come to this to notice, by the time we're done in 3 weeks, progressivism becomes the dominant philosophy in the country. And I want to help you, and next week, Professor Bryson's going to be here to help you see how that happens and what are the arenas, the other arenas that this really takes hold. And we will see in that tug of war between the Republicans and the Democrats, that progressivism will get into the political arena and kind of move us forward into the country we have now, for good or for ill. That's when we get to. All right, that is a good stopping spot for us. Thank you so much. Again, as always, I just wish there was a way to answer any questions you might have. Please don't hesitate to ask me any questions, either by email or through Becca, however would be good for you. Thank you for being here tonight. And I'm sorry I went a few minutes long, and I will talk to you next week with Professor Rice. She's going to be here next week, so don't miss out. You'll like it. You'll enjoy it. All right. Thank you so much.